Here is Monteverde Rose Noir, and this really feels like a great royal purple. The swatch shows some sheen that isn't present in the writing sample. There is a showing of blue in the chromatography that also doesn't show up in the writing sample. There is only slight tone shift as paper changes, and it must be in the side-by-side to see it, and it does shade well. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this performs just as well as on premium paper, and with no aggression at all, making this a great ink for student use. Now, purple is always fun to have in a rotation, so I can see being very happy with a bottle of this and being happier as I use that bottle up.
The pen for today is a Jinhao 51A. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
We get to see a very nice showing of a lighter royal purple here, especially on the bright white paper of Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, and it's very noticeable in that on the third line, where the T is a nice midtone, the H gets very dark, the A lightens up considerably, and that final T at the end, very dark. But right next to it, the word to has almost no shading. So the shading isn't going to be in every single word, but it is going to be present. It is also going to be a little more present in the more print style writing, I think, than the cursive style. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Monteverde makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Monteverde.
Here is Monteverde Green. Here is Monteverde Smoke Noir. Here is Monteverde Rose Pink. Here is Monteverde Lion.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is darker than it is on the Clairfontaine, likely a result of this paper, which is not really fountain pen friendly paper, though it tends to perform fairly well with them. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. Proof can be found in proof on the first line, where the P is considerably darker than the ROO, and the F at the end does darken just a hair. Now, some of the shading can be hard to find, but it's not always hard to find, like hard on the second line, where the H is much darker than the ARD. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now, the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we see the tone is noticeably darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, about the same tone that we were getting on the Portage, making me feel that this ink is becoming darker on the non-fountain pen friendly papers, not as a result of any kind of tone. I think this is a more opaque ink. I think it's changing tone because the more fountain pen friendly papers tend to be coated. Now, this doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does show shading, like show on the third and the fourth line, both doing it in the same way, with lighter S's, much darker H's. The OW on the third line lightens up considerably, where the OW on the fourth line works its way to the lighter tone. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, it does shade. Now, I said it's the same tone, though we do see quite a few areas that are darker. The majority of what's going on is in the same range of tones. If we look at equivalents on the third line, we see really the same tone that we had in the Clairfontaine, with bits of shading going on, like the Q, the LE, and the CE at the end. Relations shows a little darker in general as a tone, and it goes from a slightly darker general tone to an even darker in the shading, like the E being much darker than the letters around it. It does stand out against the quad rule with no kind of problem, making this a good ink to use on this type of paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more violet or purple inks.
Here is Califolio Violet. Here is Diamine Damson. Here is Lamy Beryl. Here is Pelican 4001 Violet.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, this paper will frequently alter a tone and make it flatter. It is not doing it in this case. We're still getting a very nice lighter royal purple with no feather, no spread, plenty of shading, therefore being easy to find, like therefore on the second line, where the TH is considerably darker than the ERE that lightened just a little bit, but the F becomes much darker, getting a whole lot lighter out of the F into the OR with a very dark E at the end. It still stands out against the quad rule, making it a good choice for students. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Colorverse Schrodinger.
Here is Sailor Kobe number 46 Museum Gray.
Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Electric Pink.
Here is Vinta La Paz.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is considerably darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now we can see some areas in the darker of the darker that do have little bits of feathering. These tiny bits of feathering are not something that would stop you from using it, I suppose. You can see tiny bits of feathers, not a big deal. Same with equivalents on the LE, not something that would probably stop most users. It does have a normal amount of spread for going on to copy paper, and it does show some shading. Look at intersections that shows shading in the word, but the word in general is quite a bit lighter than element directly underneath it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no overpenetration, no aggression. This is a great ink to use if you frequently use 20-pound copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The dry fine nib of the Jinhao 51A gives a nice medium tone purple with a decent shading throughout. Now off camera, I tried this in a wet fine and the tone got a bunch darker and shaded even better. So while it always looks good, this could be a dealer's choice. It looks even better from a wet fine or a wet medium pen, giving a medium dark purple with great shading.